sex and porn addiction. Y'all don't want to hear it from me anymore, so let's give it up for Darrel.
All right, I always love talking to this group, so let's get started here and find out about all you porn and sex addicts out there. All right. But I do want to start off by just mentioning the podcast. We have had an amazing thing happen. 2 weeks ago, I released if you don't listen to any of my podcasts, that's fine. I won't hold that against you, except you've got to go listen to the episode on 2 ex-Muslim women. I had an interview with these 2 incredibly brave women, and they put it up. I mean, these are women that had to leave everything to escape their homes, or they might have been physically harmed, killed, or shipped off to Yemen to marry a man they don't want to marry. This is an amazing thing, and most of my podcasts are getting between 1,000 and 2,000 downloads. This one's got over 10,000 downloads. And the United Kingdom is the second biggest download, because there's a problem there. Sweden, big problem with Islam and the treatment of women. So go listen to that and tell everybody you know, especially anybody who's from an Islamic culture. We need to be challenging this. So today we're going to talk about sex and porn addiction. I'm going to talk about 5 different components here. First of all, the roots of the concept. I'm going to explain how it's destructive to healthy sexuality. I'm going to discuss the science, or lack thereof, of sex addiction research and examine how underlying sexual issues should be treated, and explore why this is important to you and those you love and know. So, to begin with, I'm going to show you a short 2+ minute video of a interview I did with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I want you to just watch this, and as you watch it, I want you to think, do you see any patterns in what these people are saying?
Now, changing directions, Todd, you're bringing us our feature story tonight.
Yeah, the debate about whether porn addiction is real or not has been around for a long time, but when you add religion to it, it gets even more complicated.
It was kind of taking over every kind of aspect of my life.
Jason Huxley is a loving husband, father, and a devout Christian. He's also a former addict. But alcohol or drugs aren't his vice. Porn is.
I was staying up late at night watching stuff, getting up early on Saturday mornings. You know, Laura would have a sleep in and I'd have a porn in. And, you know, it sounds terrible, but that's just what I did.
Jason married Laura when he was 22. While he'd watched porn before that, he says it was only after the wedding his viewing habits spiraled out of control, to the point where he was watching up to 8 hours at a time.
And I was viewing this stuff and thinking, you know, well, I'm not really getting that kind of action in the bedroom. One day I decided she's not kind of the woman for me anymore. There's better options out there.
It's one thing to have reality, another thing to have fantasy. Fantasy never has sort of bad hair days or bad mood swings or anything like that that normal life has.
Laura refused to let Jason walk away from their marriage and agreed to help him kick the habit. She even started taking the modem with her when she left the house.
That lasted about a week until I went out and bought another modem.
What does that mean? Yeah, I didn't know about that.
So I had a decoy modem.
But the catalyst was when Jason spent a whole day viewing pornography when he was meant to be painting the house.
It kind of really hit me. Here I am, spent the whole day viewing porn, which I'm not meant to be doing, with a modem that I'm not meant to have. I've taken a day off work, so I could have been earning money today, but I didn't. No, it was just screwing up my life.
While it's clear some people are viewing porn compulsively, there is still plenty of debate in the medical community about whether it is an actual addiction, like drugs, alcohol, or gambling. Some believe it's a subcategory of sex addiction, but even that hasn't formally been recognized as an official psychiatric disorder.
I get really cross with people who say pornography is not something that you can become addicted to, because in my practice I'm seeing people, men and women, who are addicted to watching pornography, and it's seriously affecting their lives.
Because of his religiosity, Jason seems like an unlikely porn addict. But in fact, recent research out of the US has found the more religious a person is, the more likely they are to believe they're addicted to porn.
Here's a way to understand this. Don't think of a pink elephant. The minute you tell somebody not to do something, it pops into their head. If you're being told since the day you were born that sex is bad, sex is wrong, It's like religion is constantly reminding you of the very thing it doesn't want you to think about.
I tried to stop so many times and I just didn't know why I couldn't stop.
Luke Gibbons is 29, Christian, and a virgin. Like Jason, he discovered porn in his teens.
Although I was viewing like several times in the week, but it was probably the length of time, so I saw it taking up sort of all night, and I just would be glued there all night until early morning and get an hour's sleep and then go to work with hardly any sleep.
In his mid-20s, Luke checked into a rehab clinic.
There were people of all addictions in this rehab, so people who suffered from drug addiction, alcohol addiction. It was a hard time, it was pretty full on, but also the most worthwhile 6 weeks of my life.
Today, Luke abstains from pornography, just like he abstains from sex.
Porn isn't the problem. Abstinence is the problem. Human beings are programmed to reproduce. And by 16, almost every human being on this planet has got hormones that are driving them to do something sexually.
I don't think that abstinence is suppressing sexuality. I think it is an expression of sexuality. So if you want to wait until you're married, then that can be a really good thing if you want to save that until you meet the person that you want to be with.
Like Luke, Jason is now porn-free. He installed porn-blocking software on his computer and hasn't viewed the stuff in 5 years. Today, both men run the charity Guilty Pleasure, educating people about the harmful effects of pornography.
It's kind of scary. We're meant to be not viewing the stuff, according to Scripture, and we are.
The church makes you think you have a problem, then they give you a fake cure. Come back to church to get over the guilt that we taught you in the first place. It's a great marketing campaign.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really controversial thought, that the church markets guilt, which then fuels porn addiction, and then the church sells itself as the solution to that. I mean, I don't know how accurate that is, but it is a big thought.
I know it reminds me of...
So let's think about this. Do you recognize any patterns? I'd just like to get some responses from you. Any patterns you saw in there? Behavior, relationships, anything. Jump out. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, abstinence. Big pattern there. Any other pattern you saw? Isolation. Yeah, say a little bit more about that. That's a good one. What kind of isolation were you seeing there?
Just like the preference to be alone and that
Yeah. Social isolation. 29-year-old virgin, right.
Substituting computer contact with human contact?
Yeah, okay.
Correlation with religion?
Pardon?
Correlation with religion?
Yeah, in every case, in this case anyway. Now let's look at this pattern. Here's some patterns I identified. I'm sure if we talk, we'd probably come up with all of these. First of all, the notion of religious purity. That is a deeply rooted religious idea. The purity culture, as we'll talk about later. Shame, especially shame by the spouse. You'll notice his porn addiction, so-called, went up after the wedding. After the wedding. There's a little hint, isn't there? A denial of sexuality through religiously inspired abstinence. Somebody already mentioned that. A parent-child relationship between the partners. She is his mommy, and they have nanny software for the guy. Isn't that interesting? Now, last and most important, there was no clinical diagnosis here. Who is diagnosing these people? Their spouses or themselves or their religious cohorts, their minister, Sunday school teacher, elder, somebody in the church may have diagnosed them. So, keep all those things in mind. In 1983, a fellow named Patrick Carnes, I hate to say he's a psychologist, but he is, introduced the concept of sex addiction to the world with his book, Don't Call It Love. He put the whole idea of sex addiction on the map. You can just go Wikipedia him, and he has published book after book after book. About one every 2 or 3 or 4 years, new book comes out to expose all the terrible things that sex and porn addiction is doing in our culture. He has created an entire cottage industry out of this. You can hardly go to any website that deals with sex or porn addiction, and in a click or two, you'll be right back to Patrick Carnes. He is ubiquitous. He is everywhere when it comes to the addictions industry. And he's got certification programs, he's got institutes, he's got treatment programs. I don't know what the guy he's a great businessman, I'll tell you that, and he's selling a product. So all of you, I hope, how many of you completed the test? Oh, good, good. A lot of you did. Now, hold your hands up if you completed. I just want to know how many actually took it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About 50 people took it. Okay. Now, how many of you, first of all, I will tell you, I took the test. I am a sex addict. Hi, I'm Darrel. I'm a sex addict. Julie is a sex addict. George is a sex addict. Maureen is a sex addict. Barb's a sex addict. Billy's a sex addict. How many of you are sex addicts according to this test? Okay, 40. 40 out of the 50 people that took this test are sex addicts. Now let's just ask a dumb question. What kind of a test is it that identifies 80% of all the people who take it as having the problem?
Self-serving test.
Yeah. This, guys, and this, my friends, is the state-of-the-art test for sex and porn addiction today. This test is being used all over the world to identify sex addicts.
Maybe we're just a bunch of perverts.
Well, there could be some self-selection going on in your case, Andy. I'm positive of that. Okay, so let's get in and look at the science of this whole item, this whole question. First of all, I want to start with, I won't have time for questions too much until the end, or we'll be here till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But if you want to stay till 3, I'm okay with that. But I'll try to have some time at the end. Let's look at the DSM-5. It just came out the last year or so. It's the latest, greatest update of the diagnostic criteria. Now, when you're doing a diagnosis, you have to have scientifically validated criteria in order to make a diagnosis. You don't just walk into your doctor and say, I've got a fever, doctor, and he says, well, you've got the flu, or you've got a cold. You probably need to have some criteria. He has to go through a checklist, or she has to go through some kind of testing. So if you don't have criteria, you don't have a diagnosis. That's pretty simple. I think we can all agree to that. Which doctors don't have good criteria for diagnosis? And that's the difference between medicine and witch doctors. Here are the 3 criteria for being a sex addict in the DSM-5. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. See a pattern here? There are no criteria for sex addiction in the DSM-5, and it's not because people haven't tried to get it in. They have tried for 20 or 30 years. Ever since Patrick Carnes started his stuff in 1983, they've been trying to get it into the DSM. And here's an example. I just pulled this off of a website on Psychology Today of a very poorly qualified, I would say, sex addictions therapist complaining that the DSM-5 does not have sex addiction in it. The whole sex addiction industry is really pissed off that there is no diagnostic criteria for sex addiction because they think they know what that criteria should be. And we'll come back and find out why that's a problem. So I'm going to start with a quote from Dr. Alan Francis, who was the chairman of the task force for the DSM-4. That's the previous revision of the diagnostic criteria. Here's what he said about the concept of sexual addiction. Sexuality is an inherently difficult arena for psychiatric diagnosis because, number 1, the field has generated remarkably little research and few researchers. Number 2, there are no consensus norms, underline no consensus norms, in sexual behavior to provide a useful boundary for deciding what constitutes a sexual mental disorder. And number 3, individual and cultural biases play a large and difficult to sort out role. And 4, decisions regarding the diagnosis of sexual disorders can have profound and unanticipated forensic and sociological and societal implications. So there's 4 damn good reasons why it's not appearing in the DSM. If you look beneath each one of these, they are profound. If you can't address these 4 issues, then you're going to cause a hell of a lot more problems than solve if you don't identify criteria. His biggest concern in the article, and you can Google the article, it was on Psychology Today, I believe, poorly defined diagnosis can have lifelong consequences in the legal, criminal, and mental health areas. Number one. Number two, bad criteria will lead to more people being indefinitely imprisoned and involve psychiatry and sham science. Those are his two components there. Now, I worked in my first 10 years of my career in the juvenile justice system. Patrick, I got out of the juvenile justice system in 1986. But 1983 is when Patrick Carnes' book came out. I read his book. I said, this is total bullshit. And oh my God. If we start labeling boys who masturbate too much as sex addicts, we're going to have 10 times as many kids in the kiddie prisons as we've got now. And what happened? That very thing started happening shortly after that. Sex addiction became a common term in that area. So let's go to the roots of this. What are the roots of this whole sex addiction notion? It didn't really exist before 1983, or if it did, it was sporadic. The roots are in the abstinence culture. When Ronald Reagan was elected by the religious right in 1981, wasn't it? Or 1980? 80, yeah, thanks. And the moral majority came in, and all this purity culture started happening. Education started getting infiltrated with notions about abstinence only. And we see here in a previous talk, I talked about the abstinence only culture. And we can see this Air Force man with his daughter who gave his daughter a ring. And it's just weird kind of stuff. And it's going on in all these purity training courses. Fathers are giving their daughters rings and promising not to have sex until they get married. And the fathers are going to be watching over them and making sure they don't have any sex. It's actually based on the AA model. Abstinence only is based on the no alcohol model that Alcoholics Anonymous started in 1936, I think it was. And it is a helplessness model. Helplessness model means God is the only person that can help me. I can't help myself. So the AA model and the abstinence only model and the purity culture model all are models that rely on an invisible friend to help us get through the day and not have sex. Now, this is a video. You can go look at it yourself if you like. It's kind of entertaining, by a guy named Matt Fred. He is a Catholic apologist. I'm not going to show you the video. It's too much for today. But basically what Matt says in this video is that masturbation is bad, period. Because the minute you start masturbating, you think about something you shouldn't be thinking about. So what we see here is, and he's a Catholic, the Catholic abstinence only and purity culture sets this standard of total abstinence, not just from sex, but total abstinence from masturbation. So if you even watch porn once, and he says it right in this video, if you even watch porn once, you are a porn addict. How many of you are porn addicts in here? All right, we got a lot of porn addicts. Good. So, I mean, the standard is absolutely impossible and ridiculous and is meaningless to begin with. Why should you abstain from something like that? Unless it's a guilt cycle to bring you back to church, like I said in the interview with the Australian corporation. So what are the consequences of this? That's the anti-masturbation cross. There, you can buy it online for $50, I think. Your child will not masturbate or sin if you buy that for them. So, what this does, it makes people think that they're sinning or they're addicted when they're acting like normal human beings. Simply looking at porn is a pretty normal thing. We've been doing it for thousands of years. It didn't take a videotape, or the digital age to get porn out there. We know there's been porn around for probably 10,000 years or more. There's actually figurines that look pretty darn pornographic. The archaeologists have found. This approach evokes blame and it labels people who are behaving like normal human beings. And it also, probably the most insidious, or second most insidious, is it opens the door for religious shame and guilt under the guise of counseling. And there are thousands of counselors out there who will counsel you around your sex and porn addiction while shaming you and telling you to go back to Jesus. Last, and I would put number one on my list, is it promotes an anti-science agenda in the practice of psychology and counseling. You saw a psychologist in that video say she gets cross with people when they don't admit there's porn addiction. Well, bullshit. she doesn't know how to diagnose that, and we'll get back to why that is. So, sex addiction research. Let's look at the sex addiction research. Since 1983, there's been little or no research out there. The research criteria are terrible. If you look at a study that's so-called dealing with sex addiction, you'll find all sorts of holes in it, and they rarely follow a good scientific protocol. They know the answer they want, and they're going to go out there and find the data that will support that answer. Therefore, you will find no peer-reviewed journals that have confirmatory evidence of sex addiction. No peer-reviewed scientific journals. Now, I'm not saying you can't find sex addiction journals. They got a whole bunch of sex addiction journals, but they don't have research in them that would stand up in a peer-reviewed American Psychological Association journal. And folks, the test you took today is the state of the art for sex and porn addiction. That's the state of the art. And it will identify 80% of the people who take it as some kind of sex and porn addict. That's pretty crazy. So, who's doing the diagnosis here? First of all, we see lots of media. Media are diagnosing people. I mean, how many media said Bill Clinton was a porn addict, or a sex addict, I'm sorry. How many spouses are going to their minister and saying, I think my husband's a sex addict? Or the elders are going to the wife and say, we think your husband's a sex addict. How many parents are identifying their children because they caught them masturbating? Hey, if you're a Mormon and you masturbate, you're a sex addict. That's pretty clear, right, Mormons? Ex-Mormons in here? You are not supposed to. Mitt Romney will tell you you cannot masturbate if you're a Mormon. And he never masturbates, I'm sure. Remember, he was a bishop. He was a bishop in the Mormon church. The bishops are the ones that have to take and hand a 4-page piece of paper to every 12-year-old boy and talk to him about masturbation. So we know for a fact that Mitt Romney has actively told 12-year-old boys not to masturbate. There's no doubt, because he was a bishop. That's the job of the bishops. Preachers and religious authorities are doing the diagnosis. People are diagnosing themselves. These two guys you saw in that video were self-diagnosed. They didn't say, I went to a psychologist and he said I was, or she said I was a porn addict or a sex addict. And worst of all, sex addiction counselors are doing the diagnosis. And they're often very religious people themselves. So the addictions industry, their research is woefully inadequate, if non-existent. Like I said earlier, for the last 50 years, there has been ever since no research on sex addiction. But here's more important. And I'm going to broaden that picture a little bit more so we can kind of understand this whole idea of the sex addictions industry. Since 1938, there has been no credible research that shows that Alcoholics Anonymous works. None. Now, the Alcoholics Anonymous people will swear to you that it works, but ask them to produce the scientific evidence that shows Alcoholics Anonymous works, and they can't do it. Now, if I went to the Catholic Church and I said, I would like you to scientifically prove that Catholicism works, you think we could make that happen? No, religions do not want you looking too carefully, too closely at what works and what doesn't work. And neither does the addictions industry, because it's not scientifically based. Alcoholics Anonymous there's no science to it. Now, I'm not saying people don't say that they were helped, but most of those people would have been helped by going to a good group therapy session or going to a counselor. Going to an AA group doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't have gotten better in some other way. So there's no peer-reviewed research there, and there's no peer-reviewed research for Alcoholics or Sex Anonymous. So here's the model that Alcoholics Anonymous started in the 1930s, and unfortunately has bled over into the sex addictions industry. And that is that alcoholism is a progressive disease. Once you get it, it progresses until death. That's what we mean by progressive disease. And the Alcoholics Anonymous says, unless you come to us, you're probably going to die of alcoholism. That's the theory that all of AA is based upon. It's also the theory that all of Sexaholics Anonymous is based upon as well. But that's a popular notion, and there's no scientific evidence for it. There's never been any research that established that theory has any basis in reality. In 1962, a fellow named Charles Winnick did some research on 4 different kinds of addictions: alcohol, drugs, and alcohol, drugs. He wasn't looking at sex addiction only. And what he found shocked him so much that he himself didn't believe his own data. He published the data with grave doubts. And generally the addictions community, which had already by that time been pretty infused with Alcoholics Anonymous dogma, didn't believe it either. But I want you to look at this graph. This is right out of his manuscript. It was published in 1962. This is age down here, and at age 20 to about 25, you see a peak in addictions. And look how fast the addictions go down. The addictions go down by age 30 as much as they went up from age 20. So there's a real fast peak and a real fast drop. What he found in this research was most addicts get over their addiction with no help whatsoever. The only reason we think this progresses until death is because there are a few people where it seems to. But this blows away the theory that Alcoholics Anonymous is based upon, that people have to come back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And it also blows the theory for sex addiction, as we'll see a little bit later. As of March of this year, Science News ran a big article on the paradox, the addictions paradox, and they had a similar graph. You'll have to look at this graph as kind of the opposite direction. And I'm not trying to bore you with graphs here today. I just want you to see that the research is out there on the science side about this stuff. You can't find these kinds of graphs anywhere in the addictions industry. So what this tells us is the rate at which people get over their addiction. It's kind of the reverse. And what it does show us is that people get over their addictions to alcohol and tobacco much more slowly. It takes 30 years to get over an alcohol or drug addiction. But these addictions here are marijuana and cocaine. And what they found is people get over their cocaine addiction pretty darn quickly, as do they get over any addiction or so-called addiction to marijuana. I'm not here to argue whether marijuana's addicted or not, okay? So, here's the deal. People mature out of their addiction. In fact, Winnick's title of his article, his research was Growing Out of Addiction. He established with his early research that people, whatever the reason they got addicted before, they grow out of it. And life events are among the most common reasons that people become addicted. They go through a divorce. They leave home for the first time and they go crazy on alcohol. There's a death in the family. They get married. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why somebody might get addicted. But they grow out of it as they mature. The hypothesis that people become addicted and stay for the rest of their life then is not supported in this either. It's more supported in these tobacco and alcohol than it is in the other two. But let's look at the sex addiction research. Now, we've got some criteria for diagnosing maybe alcohol abuse, but we don't have any sex addiction criteria, so we can't see a graphic like this. It's impossible. The research isn't there. So there is no research, 80 years of research in AA, 50 years of research in sex addiction, and it's non-existent. And they're really masquerading this stuff. The AA masquerades this stuff as a scientific approach. Sex addiction, scientific approach. You go to a sex addictions training course, you'll get all sorts of scientific jargon, but no evidence that what you're getting ready to go out and do works. Now, let me suggest that we're really looking at a religion here. We're not looking at a scientific approach to treatment of a problem. Do not hear me saying there's no problems. People do have problems with sex. People do have problems with alcohol. People do have problems with drugs. I am not saying that. I'm saying the diagnosis is critical to understanding how to do the treatment. If you look at the Sexaholics Anonymous, most of us are familiar with 12 steps of AA, right? Okay, you don't need to read this, and it's too small to read, but you can see the red. See the red words in there? Every one of those relates to a religion, to God, to a higher power. Of the 12 steps, I think 9 of them have something to do with God. You see any pattern there? This is not a scientifically based treatment approach. It is a God-based treatment approach. It is an invisible friend religious approach. When you talk about Alcoholics Anonymous, What we know is that in 1938, a new religion was born in the United States, and it's called Alcoholics Anonymous. People are being told, you're helpless, you have to find this higher power. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it, but lately, Alcoholics Anonymous has been backing off big time about this higher power bullshit. And there's, oh, whatever God you have. If the doorknob is your God, then that's your higher power. I literally had an Alcoholics Anonymous facilitator, I don't know what they call them, say that. If the doorknob is your higher power, then that's okay. Well, yeah, why are they doing that? Because they're losing members. They're losing members over this idea. And I've even heard, now this is shocking to me, that there is an atheist Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know what their 12 Steps looks like, but it can't have any gods in it, I'm sure of that. So Sexaholics Anonymous looks like a religion to me, just like Alcoholics Anonymous does. So I call what we're seeing here the Oprah effect. Oprah says there's something, there's such a thing as sex addiction, and suddenly everybody believes it. It could be Dr. Phil effect, Dr. Drew effect. You know, there's a lot of people out there pushing this stuff. So, the conflict over sex addiction is important for humanists. I'm going to quote from an article by Dr. Marty Klein, probably one of the nation's preeminent sex therapists. Sex addiction is a special weapon now used by religious right to combat perceived liberalism, to ignore science, and to ignite fear. It also helps legitimize anti-sex moralism and bigotry. And psychologists, judges, legislators, and the media are buying it. Dr. Marty Klein. You might want to look at his book. The article is available. He published this article in the Humanist magazine last year. He's also got a great book out called America's War on Sex. Really worth reading. So what is the harm? What's the harm in calling it sex addiction? It's just a label. Well, think about this. People are labeling other people based upon no criteria at all. Oprah can get on the show and label a movie star. I do not diagnose people that I've never met. And yet you see Dr. Phil doing this all the time, Dr. Drew, you see people doing this. People are self-diagnosing. And it perpetuates the myth of disease. And spouses, the worst thing, spouses are diagnosing. Only because they caught their husband watching porn. Now my husband's a porn addict. Or my husband had an affair. My wife had an affair, so they must be a sex addict. So, it's so-called sex addictions professionals are also diagnosing, and they're treating people based on unscientific criteria, often with very hidden religious beliefs behind them. And for that, I want to show you a website. This is a website that's showing you the 2 signs your husband is a sex addict or a porn addict. And you'll notice something in the upper left-hand corner. It's sponsored by Covenant Eyes. Whoa, that is nanny software. That was originally designed to keep children from doing porn, but now it's designed to keep husbands from doing porn. And wives can buy it from this site and spy on their husbands. I'm wondering, you see any relationship problems here? Yeah. This ain't sex addiction, this is relationship problems, what it amounts to. Let's go on to KCUR, which I am pissed about. We can almost see it from here. A year ago, they had 2 sex addiction therapists on their site. One has a PhD in psychology. And they were just spewing all sorts of bullshit. I mean, totally unscientific statements about what sex addiction is and what it isn't. And I was just livid. I called in half hour into the show, plenty of time to get on. They asked me what I wanted to talk about, and I said, I want to challenge the entire notion of sex addiction. Needless to say, I did not get on the show that day. Several other callers got on. They had a whole lot of talk. There was plenty of time to get me in. They did not want to talk to me. They didn't want me challenging this. And this was the woman that was on this, Dr. Barbara Stevens. So I get a little suspicious. But before I do that, I couldn't get on the show, so I wrote a long letter outlining all the arguments against what they were talking about to KCUR. I copied 3 other people, station manager Steve Krasky, and I can't remember the gal on Central Standard. They have never gotten back to me in a year. So when I scheduled this talk, I started writing them again. I've written them twice. I've copied them several times. I think a few of you have even written them. Has anybody received a response from KCUR? I haven't. You might write them after you hear this talk. So I got suspicious and started looking into this person's qualifications. They never mention her qualifications in this. But she graduated from Regent University. Anybody heard of that one? Yeah, that's Pat Robertson's university, where they teach people that hurricanes go to Orlando and New Orleans because of the gays that are there. They literally teach that shit. Now, she has a degree from Pat Robertson, a degree from Xavier University, and another degree from St. Joseph. See a pattern there? All religious. Now, last but not least, let's look at the doctoral program in psychology at Regent's University. I'm just going to read the first and last sentences. Our curriculum trains psychologists in a manner consistent with biblical truths and historical Christian worldview. This is the PhD program. Here's the end of it. In this course, students can expect the instructor to both guide and join students in understanding the role and effect of the fallen human condition on mental health and well-being. I'm sure they have tons of scientifically validated research on the fallen human condition and mental health. So, what they failed to tell us on KCUR was this woman is a fucking fundamentalist. Now, she talks like she's a psychologist, she knows the lingo, but she went to Pat Robertson University. How more can you get? Maybe Bob Jones, that might be more fundamentalist, but it would be hard to be more fundamentalist than Pat Robertson's University. And KCUR had this person on, gave them tons of credibility by having, and never let anyone challenge the bullshit they were putting out that day. You might think I'm a little passionate about this. I am. So here's the deal. In my view, the sex addictions industry field is really a form of religious indoctrination and shaming, especially shaming of men. You see a lot less of this around women being porn addicts. But you'll notice this test I gave you is only for men. How many women took it and were sex addicts? Yeah, okay. Thank you. So what we see is we see nanny software, we see the majority of the articles. You go online, Cosmo, any Oprah, any of those. Google Oprah and sex addiction. You'll see a half a dozen programs over the last 10 years. She is really into sex addiction and porn addiction. But the majority of the articles are about men. It's shaming of men and men's sexuality. And it's women and wives support groups. You can get online and find sex addiction support groups for women dealing with their addicted husbands. It's always the women, I need support. Help me get through this trying time where my husband keeps watching porn. And it's almost always closely tied to churches. I won't say this is 100%, but go to most of these sex addiction sites and click through a bunch of the links that are on there. In almost all the time you're going to find a church somewhere or a religious organization. It might be the Catholic Church, it might be the Baptist Church. And also, always look where these people got their qualifications. It's almost always at a religious organization. So, thousands of people are being misdiagnosed and mistreated by charlatans. And I think anybody who's got a sex addiction practice is a charlatan. And the reason they're a charlatan is the same reason you would not go to a homeopathic physician. How many of you guys go to homeopathic physicians? Why don't we go to homeopathic physicians? Because there's no science behind it. And that's why we wouldn't go to a sexaholic or sex addict. And Dr. Drew is one of the chief proponents of this kind of stuff. And he's made millions of dollars off of this stuff. So let me give you a terrifying example of why this is so important. This is Oxbow Academy. It's been labeling boys as sex addicts for 20 years. Can you imagine labeling a 12-year-old boy a sex addict? And yet they do it. 12 to 18-year-old boys are being sent from all over the United States to this secular organization in Utah. Let that sink in. Secular organization in Utah. They claim they're a secular organization, but virtually all their staff are Mormon. Virtually all our staff have their degrees from Brigham Young University. Now, I don't know about you, did you know you have to sign a pledge that you will not masturbate and you will not have sex while attending Brigham Young University, unless you can have sex if you're married. But if you're not married, you can't masturbate, you can't have sex. You have to actually sign a pledge. So we've got these staff members, these two guys, there's more staff members, these are the top two guys. Clinical director, that's interesting. And he has a LCSW, I believe it was a master MSW from Brigham Young University. Now, think about this. sex positive values. Are you going to learn sex positive values at Brigham Young University? Ain't no way. If they think masturbation is wrong, which they do, clearly do. I don't know if you saw that video came out, produced by the president of Brigham Young University in Montana last year. It was this guy watching porn, and his friend catches him doing it. Now he's got to go to the elders and talk to them about masturbating. And I mean, this is a Mormon video that went viral. And then the Mormon church said, oh shit, people are making fun of us. And they pulled it off their website, but you can still find it. It is a blast. It's really kind of spooky, scary, and weird, but yeah. So these are the kinds of people that are counseling 12 to 14, 18-year-old boys and telling them that they are sex addicts. That is totally wrong. Think about it. Think about when you were 12 years old or 15 years old, your mother caught you masturbating or caught you watching porn, and they labeled you as a sex addict and sent you off. How would that feel? This is a lifelong label that can ruin somebody, can hurt somebody emotionally for decades, if not a lifetime. So, let's review here. I want to review all the research that we've had since 1983. There is no credible research of any kind, nada, zero, none, zilch, is that clear? On sex addiction and sex addiction treatment, sex addiction treatment or diagnosis. There's no recidivism studies. Ask this ranch, this so-called ranch, what their recidivism statistics are. Now, in recidivism, it means you go back to doing the thing you were doing. Ask them. They don't have it. Ask Alcoholics Anonymous about their recidivism studies. There are none. There was no randomized studies. There's no double-blind studies. There's no long-term follow-up studies. There's nothing in the sex addiction industry, just like there's nothing in the alcohol addictions industry. So, sex addiction, I think sex and porn addiction diseases are really diseases of religion. They're not a disease. They're humans behaving like humans. If you eliminate the religious bullshit, the shame, the guilt that is taught to children, or us in early life, you oftentimes can treat whatever the underlying problem is. And I'm going to go into that. So, Marty Klein wrote this article called You Are Addicted to What? Go Google it, read it. It's a great article. He said that addiction is an excuse to avoid personal responsibility. You recognize this guy, Anthony Weiner. The only Democrat that had to leave because he had a sex addiction. I mean, the guy in Louisiana didn't have to leave. The guy Craig in Montana didn't have to leave. Republicans don't have to leave because they can always say, oh, I'm an addict, I went to treatment, I come back to the Congress or the Senate. Works pretty well. It didn't work for him though, too well. And he didn't even fuck anybody. All he did was send pictures. I mean, what's worse? Fucking a prostitute, knocking on the bathroom to get some gay sex, or sending somebody a picture. Congress makes no sense to me sometimes. Another book, well worth a read, called by Dr. David Lay. He is the first person, his book came out the same year my book came out, Sex and God. I wish I'd have known about his book. I'd have incorporated some of his concepts in my own work. But it's a great book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. He goes into a lot of the details, much more than what I'm doing here today. But he says, a diagnosis of sex addiction is superfluous at best, and a dangerous distraction from the real treatment needed at worst. In another place, he says, it's easier to say that sex is the problem rather than trying to identify the individual issues that might lead an individual to sex-related problems. I am not saying there's not problems with sex, but let's not call it sex addiction. He also says, sex addiction is this latest tool of anti-sex morality embedded in our culture at its deepest levels, labeling sexuality as a dangerous, evil temptation that must be constantly constrained and feared. Those are 3 quotes from his excellent book. And of course, we see here the guy that helps you pray the gay away. If you're Michelle Bachman's, my gaydar says the guy's gay as the day is long. But and we also know where is the greatest levels of porn addiction, so-called? Well, it's in Utah, and it's in this whole area of the South. The more religious an area is, the more it tends to be the porn belt as well as the Bible belt. The study they cited in the video I showed you earlier says this, that porn viewing habits were no different between religious and non-religious people, but perception of addiction was closely related to religiosity. That's what they said, that's what the study says that they talked about in the video I showed you earlier. They went on to say, we were surprised that the amount of viewing did not impact the perception of addiction, but strong moral beliefs did. So if you're watching porn and you're religious, you're going to self-identify and self-diagnose as a porn addict. If you're an atheist watching porn, wow, what's the big deal? I got off today, you know, tonight I'll see my husband or wife will get off again. Keeps the pipes clean and the juice is flowing. That's the attitude of an atheist, more likely. But this poor religious person who is now guilty from having watched porn today, and his wife or her husband comes home, and he's all scared to death, oh no, that's going to create anxiety, it's going to create confessional guilt, I need to go talk to my priest, my minister, I need to confess to my husband or my wife, you know, and that creates a whole cycle that feeds itself in the religious guilt cycle that I talk about extensively in my book, The God Virus. So, the addictions treatment industry is really focused on abstinence only. Now, alcohol, AA is focused on that too. If you go to AA, you can't have a drink the rest of your life, right? That's their model. Well, they try to take the same model and say you can't have sex for the rest of your life. And it ain't gonna work too well, is it? No. So they've had to kind of modify that a little bit. But, and it does go from person to from church to church, how moral it is to do things like masturbate. But pornography is always on the list. And there's lots and lots of moral judgments in their industry, and it's very poorly diagnosed, as I talked about earlier, no criteria, culture. Is this guy a porn addict or sex addict, do you think? People have called him that. Oprah has called him that, all right? How about Mae West? Do you think she was a sex addict? She said, I was once pure as snow, but then I drifted. So, are there problems with sex? Yes, sex can be problematic. But let's not call it addiction. There's lots of problematic behaviors. You could look at Facebook too much, and we would call you a Facebook addict. Any Facebook addicts in here? Look at that! There's more Facebook addicts than sex addicts in here. Marvelous. We're starting a Facebook group tonight. You're the first. You're the first.
He doesn't do it at all.
Let me show you some problematic behaviors. This is Larry Craig, the guy that knocks on bathroom doors and then says he's not a gay guy. A man, after he gets divorced, masturbates for 4 hours a day. Or a husband is away on military duty and his wife starts picking up men at the local bar. A teenage boy steals pornographic magazines from the gas station. A single woman says she never wants to be married, and she prefers married men because they're less trouble. Okay? Which one of these people is a sex addict? Well, according to the sex addictions industry, they're all sex addicts. But I would say none of them are sex addicts. All of them have some problems. And those problems can be dealt with in rational ways that reduce harm to them. If it's a harmful behavior that's hurting them or other people, yeah, let's deal with it. But the word addiction adds no information, none whatsoever. Harmful behaviors need to have treatment and need assistance. I'm not denying that at all. The addiction label only adds shame and guilt to the diagnosis and a destructive moral component. People who are ashamed actually more often avoid treatment. If you feel ashamed of your behavior, you will avoid treatment. Therefore, you will get worse. Is it any wonder that religious people get worse? Because they're ashamed and they're also told, you don't, psychology isn't the right spot. Jesus is the right spot. Prayers are right. Bible reading, all those things. So there's more and more and more shame. Is it any wonder they start getting into extremely harmful behaviors? So, why is this a dangerous concept? It's dangerous for this reason. The judicial system is starting to pick up on it. Judges in juvenile courts are starting to call mainly boys sex addicts. That is dangerous. When you start labeling people things that have no scientific validity. Judges are referring children and people to sex addiction centers that are really religious indoctrination centers around sexual shame and guilt. Sex addiction treatment has a hell of a lot of, as we saw here, all those God references, a lot of religious bullshit. Children are being labeled. Parents are being told by clergy that their child is a sex addict. Teachers are telling parents their child is a sex addict. Religious groups are using abstinence-only training on children to get them to do something that's incredibly unnatural for children, not have sex before marriage and not masturbate. Children are calling each other sex addicts on the playground or in the locker room. That is bullshit. This whole concept is now, everybody is diagnosing everybody as a sex addict. And if it sticks, it could be very harmful to people. And worse, the media. The media is labeling all sorts of people sex addicts. So why does it matter? I want to quote from Dr. Marty Klein's article again. When homosexuality was called a mental illness, it mattered. When women were called frigid, or nymphomaniacs, or hysterics, it mattered. When a patient is diagnosed as possessing a devil instead of schizophrenia, it clearly matters. It determines the treatment to be used and who is qualified to administer the treatment. Currently, sex addiction cannot be treated properly because there's no diagnosis for it. Witch doctors can diagnose it. Sex addiction counselors can diagnose it. But they're about equal in competence and scientific validity. So it does matter what we use. We've been going around, in this culture we say, oh, she's just OCD, or I'm OCD. And we label people, oh, he's anal retention. We throw these words around that are psychological terms. And we do it for fun, and we don't think it has any meaning. Well, sometimes it does. And when you use the word sex addiction, it does have meaning, and it can hurt people. So I want to get rid of this. I want to challenge the religious world to this, get rid of this notion about sex addiction, and expose it for what it is, a religious notion. So the scientific approach to this whole issue would be to understand underlying beliefs, as we do in cognitive behavioral therapy. We would look for depression. We would look for compulsive behavior. We would look for self-destructive behavior. We would try to understand the circumstances of the person right now. Has there been a death in the family? Is there a divorce? Has there been an illness? Have they been through an illness? And there's those kinds of things that will impact somebody's behavior in the current time. And I'd want to understand some of the early childhood training, and maybe was there sex abuse? Has there been a rape in the past? Those kinds of things might help me in helping to diagnose somebody, not diagnose them as a sex addict. Help them diagnose whatever the mental illness is or the mental issue is that's underlying that. One of the most successful treatment approaches, and there's several approaches. I'm not going to give you a whole rundown of them. One of the most successful ones is something called harm reduction. And it works for alcohol, it works for drugs, it works for sex. It's a simple concept. Let's find out how you're harming yourself or other people. Let's measure that, and then let's set goals for reducing that. Now that's the quick version of it. So if you're masturbating 4 hours a day, and you're not getting enough work done or whatever, what do you want to do? How do you want to control that? Well, how about 3 hours a day? How about 2 hours a day? And the person sets their own goals, and we try to reduce the harm. Now, eventually they may get down to a level of masturbation that's satisfactory to their lifestyle. It's not an immoral thing. If you want to masturbate an hour a day, if you got an extra hour, go for it. I really don't care how much. What I do is want to reduce the harm that's being created by it. And you're the person that identified that you're experiencing harm. You're not harming somebody because Jesus cries every time you masturbate. You're harming because you missed work today. So this guy up here that missed work, yeah, I think he's got a problem. And he's also got a problem with his wife. They need to get their act together. She is not his mother or his nanny. And if it's causing harm in some way, like missing work, let's look at that. So, I could go on and on about this, but harm reduction is a measurable, empirical way to help somebody who's in some kind of self-destructive behavior. There's other treatments, there's deeper treatments, there's drug treatments as well. So there's a whole great number of things that can be done, and sex addiction specialists oftentimes aren't even trained in this stuff. They're very poorly trained. Marriage and family therapists are among the most poorly trained people on the planet. Your third grade student might be better trained than some of those people. Sex therapists. Let's look at sex therapists. Sex therapists generally hate the term sex addiction, and they don't use it. Sex therapists practice guilt and shame-free therapy. and they use sex-positive values in their therapy. And the term sex addiction, for example, does not occur in anywhere on the website of the American Board of Sexology. Now, if the people most concerned with human sexuality, the American Board of Sexology, don't even have a reference to sex addiction in there, what does that tell you? These are people who actually research. They've got scientific evidence behind their bullshit, but the Christians have nothing behind theirs. Well, I shouldn't say bullshit, I'm sorry. All right. So, here's the deal. I'm going to give you a quick tip here. If you follow this, you'll be good the rest of your life. What do you do if you encounter a sex addiction counselor? You run. Run, get out of the way, they can be contagious. The thing that's contagious is their moral shaming, and they have very sophisticated ways of making you feel bad about your body and your sexuality. And it sounds like great psychology because Pat Robertson teaches them all the terms, all the right terms. And then underlying that is all the moral bullshit that they have. So, when in doubt about a treatment, ask them, show me the science. Ask a sex addictions counselor to show the science, and you will get a blank stare because there is none. Okay, I want to finish by reading a quick. If you are not, David, where are you, David? Yeah, he's my best friend here today. He's actually reading this book, and he got to my chapter, but he hadn't read my chapter yet. This is a good book. I really enjoy it. I actually haven't read it all yet. It's pretty good size, but I really like it. It's called Christianity's Not Great by John Loftus, and I have a chapter 18 in here. Imagine no religion in your sex life. I think John Lennon could have written that song. What would sex be like in a society without religion? How would society be without religion's sexual interference? For starters, guilt and shame would be far less common. Most guilt messages come from notions of sin, uncleanliness, original sin, and so forth. Relationships and marriages would not have the notions of Jesus watching and interfering with how you express your sexuality. Then, of course, the whole rationale for denying same-sex relationships and marriage would disappear. There's no secular reasons to deny marriage to same-sex couples. Using scientific approaches to sexuality, rather than religious notions, would take away the rigid concepts around the gender binary. Transsexuals would be as normal as heterosexuals. Pansexuality, bisexuality, and other variations would be seen simply as different expressions of sexuality. Menstruation would be seen simply as part of being human, with no supernatural sanctions or myths about uncleanliness. The same would hold for masturbation, as well as sex before, during, and after marriage. Without religion, there would be no celibate priests trying to rape little boys and girls, no fundamentalist preachers telling young girls that God wants them to have sex with them, and no Sunday school teachers would shame girls and boys when asking questions about sex. I want to leave you with that thought. What would our culture be like without religion with respect to our sexuality? And what would our culture be like if we didn't have sex addiction as a concept underlying human interactions, marriages, relationships with parents, with children, with co-workers? So I want you to start thinking about how you challenge sex addiction beliefs in our culture. How do you challenge the teacher you work next to or the neighbor you've got? We're going to put this up as a video because I want to start challenging this stuff. Nobody has stood up except David Lay and Marty Klein. They're the only two people I know who stood up and said, look, we got to challenge this religious bullshit because it just causes problems. It gets people in prison in trouble. It gets kids into kiddie prisons. It makes judges do things they wouldn't do if they were using science. There's lots of negative consequences to our culture. So, thanks for letting me preach at you for almost an hour here. I really appreciate it. And let's get out here and challenge this bullshit notion. Thank you.